In 2024, in the Caribbean of the Americas, Tom and his family are vacationing here on their yacht. Today is their son Ben's 13th birthday, and the four of them are taking the opportunity to relax and unwind. Their daughter Kathy is lying on the deck enjoying the sunshine. Tom is at the stern teaching Ben how to fish, and his wife Julia has dived into the water. Everything seems so perfect, but while Julia was swimming, she suddenly felt something bump into her, and then a strange force pulled her downward. She panicked instantly and struggled, calling out to her family for help. Fortunately, Tom noticed something was wrong in time, steered the boat over to his wife, and leapt into the water to rescue Julia. Back on the boat, Julia was still shaken and had no idea what had just happened. As night fell, the family gathered to celebrate Ben's birthday. Suddenly, Cassie's boyfriend called her on a video call. Through the screen, Cassie noticed that behind him, dark clouds were gathering and lightning was flashing, creating an ominous atmosphere. But before she could ask anything, the signal was suddenly lost. Cassie had no choice but to take her laptop to her father for help, but unexpectedly, something strange was happening around them as well. A large group of whales was swimming toward the shore in droves. Tom took the opportunity to explain that whales navigate using the Earth's magnetic field, and perhaps the storm had disrupted the magnetic field, causing them to lose their sense of direction. But just as they were speculating, a whale suddenly crashed into the top of the boat, damaging the engine so that it could no longer move. Fortunately, they were stopped on a shipping lane, so as long as a ship passed by, they could be rescued. However, before the couple could catch their breath, the radar detected an object rapidly approaching. The family stepped out of the cabin to check, and to their shock, they saw a meteor tearing through the darkness, trailing a long tail of fire as it plunged into the sea. Then, another one followed closely behind, even closer and more powerful. Tom instantly panicked and tried to steer the boat away, but no matter how hard he tried, the yacht simply wouldn't move forward. To make matters worse, a meteor came hurtling straight toward them, but fortunately, it streaked over their heads and landed in the sea nearby. At this point, the four of them were completely terrified. Not knowing what else to do, they could only hide inside the cabin, lock all the doors and windows, put on their life jackets, and pray to survive this disaster. The wind and waves grew even stronger, making Cassie vomit uncontrollably, while Julia, inexplicably, started to have a nosebleed. The family stumbled and staggered as they tried to hide deeper inside, their sense of despair growing ever more intense. No one knew how much time had passed before things finally calmed down. Tom was the first to step outside, only to be confronted by a scene that defied all understanding. All the seawater had vanished without a trace. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but a bare seabed, with only a few stranded little fish silently bearing witness that this had once been a vast ocean. Once they recovered from their shock, they began to consider what they should do next. He took out his compass and found that the magnetic field was in complete chaos. The directions of north and south had been completely reversed. This meant that the sea had become land and the land had turned into ocean. But such an explanation sounded far too fantastical. For now, what mattered was figuring out how to survive. Julia gathered up the remaining food. Tom worked on repairing the walkie-talkie, trying to establish contact with the outside world. Ben, on the other hand, placed a bunch of balloons in a high spot, hoping to attract the attention of any survivors. As Tom increased the power, the walkie-talkie lit up again, and after a long silence, a human voice finally came through. The person on the other end introduced himself as Nava, a deep-sea surveyor who had been operating a submarine when the disaster struck and had narrowly escaped harm. He then confirmed Tom's suspicion. It was indeed the magnetic field reversal that caused the oceans to flood the land. But he went on to say that, according to the data, the magnetic field would return to normal in a week, and when that happened, all the seawater would come rushing back. He urged Tom to get to higher ground as soon as possible. But in just 7 days, it would be impossible for the family to make it out of the seabed. Tom hoped they could take shelter in Nava's submarine. Julia also pleaded, saying that she was a doctor and begged Nava to save the two children. Her words moved Nava, who then volunteered his coordinates. Tom quickly marked the location on the map, estimating that they could reach it in 2 or 3 days. The couple breathed a sigh of relief, feeling that hope for survival was finally within reach. They planned to rest on the boat for the night so they could recharge and set out on their journey the next day. Early the next morning, Julia and Casey began organizing the food supplies. Tom was standing on the deck, keeping an eye on their surroundings, when he suddenly spotted a man staggering toward them, armed and accompanied by a hunting dog. Seeing another survivor appear, Tom was instantly excited. He walked forward and greeted the man, but the man didn't respond, just stared at the water bottle in Tom's hand. Noticing how down and out the man looked, Tom couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy and handed the water bottle over to him. Julia, who was inside the cabin, saw what was happening and came over as well, wanting to welcome the man. Unexpectedly, after finishing the water, the man suddenly punched Tom to the ground, then grabbed a weapon and viciously stabbed him in the stomach, before expressionlessly thrusting it into his throat. The horrifying scene left Julia utterly terrified. She never imagined her husband would be brutally killed right before her eyes. Overcome with fear, she turned and ran, but the man, having already dealt with Tom, grabbed his weapon and hurled it at her with all his might. Fortunately, it only grazed Julia's arm. Fighting through the pain, she returned to the cabin, locked the door, and told her children to hide under the seats. She handed Casey a flare gun for protection, then grabbed a knife and quickly hid herself in the lower level. By this time, the man had already broken down the cabin door and was devouring food ravenously, showing no restraint. Afterward, he began searching for Julia's whereabouts, but when he burst through the door, he found the room completely empty. It turned out that Julia had already escaped through a hole to the outside of the boat, hiding below and barely daring to breathe, successfully fooling the man as he poked his head out to look around. But just as she was about to leave, the man's hunting dog suddenly lunged at her. With no other choice, Julia had to fight back with her knife. Hearing the commotion, the man came out of the cabin and saw his beloved dog lying on the ground, overcome with grief. Julia took the opportunity to circle around to the bow of the boat and crawled into the cockpit through a broken window. She cautiously moved forward, intending to escape with her children, but was struck down by the man. The death of his beloved dog drove the man completely mad. He stomped on Julia's wrist, forcing her to release the dagger in pain, then gripped her neck tightly, trying to strangle her to death. Seeing her mother about to lose her life, Casey, who was hiding under the seat, could no longer hold back. She stood up, aimed at the man, and mustered the courage to pull the trigger. The powerful impact instantly knocked the man back, but it also ignited a raging fire inside the cabin. Julia dared not delay. She quickly helped her children escape, then headed into the inner room herself. While distracting the man, she also grabbed the map showing Bill Nava's location that was their hope for survival. When they reached the outside, Ben, filled with grief, threw himself onto his father's body, begging him to wake up. Julia and Casey were also overwhelmed with pain, but just as the three of them were huddled together in tears, Julia suddenly saw the man walking out of the raging fire. Her grief was instantly replaced by terror. She forcefully pulled Ben, who refused to leave, and fled into the distance with her children. The three of them ran frantically all the way and came to a narrow gap. Casey wanted to persuade her brother to have a sip of water, but Ben was still immersed in grief and paid no attention at all. This made her lose her patience, and she finally voiced the resentment she had been holding inside, blaming the balloon in the sky for attracting the man, which ultimately led to their father's tragic death. Hearing this, Ben was stunned so he was actually the one to blame. Seeing this, Julia hurried to comfort her son, emphasizing that his father's death had nothing to do with him, and that the man was the real monster. As they spoke, the man had already caught up, and the three of them dared not delay any longer. They could only keep running. On the way, Ben spotted a stranded hammerhead shark. Filled with curiosity, he reached out to examine this strange creature. But that relentless man appeared again around the corner, and Julia's heart leapt into her throat once more. Dragging her son, they dashed forward, the three of them running across the dried up seabed, skirting a marsh littered with toxic iron cans, and passing by a mountain of garbage piled high with plastic barrels. Julia suddenly noticed that Ben's face was pale and realized he was severely dehydrated, so she decided they should stop and rest for a while. But when she took out the water bottle, she found there was only one last sip of water left. Casey looked guilty and admitted that after she finished drinking, she forgot to screw the cap back on. This made Julia furious, and she started complaining to her daughter non-stop. Casey, on the other hand, was extremely pessimistic and believed they were doomed. Both mother and daughter were angry, and for a while, they argued heatedly. Julia simply ignored her daughter, took her son, and continued on. Casey didn't dare fall behind and followed, gritting her teeth. They climbed over a high mountain and discovered a crashed plane below. Seeing the sun gradually setting in the west, Julia decided they would spend the night inside the plane. She forced open the cabin door, and a damp smell rushed out. The cabin was filled with mud and seaweed, but with nightfall approaching, this was already the safest place they could find. The three of them had no choice but to endure the discomfort, and each found a spot to rest. As her emotions gradually calmed, Julia began telling her children the story of how she and their father fell in love. It was once her sweetest memory, but now it was filled only with sorrow. In the stillness of the night, Casey suddenly felt the urge to pee. she quietly slipped out of the plane to relieve herself, unaware that the devilish man had already appeared behind her. Just as he was about to attack Casey, Julia suddenly rushed out of her motherly instincts, erupting with explosive force.
Okay. Sure.
Julia gripped the dagger tightly, screaming as she repeatedly stabbed the man. Casey slowly recovered from her terror and hurriedly stopped her mother, who had lost all reason. However, the man had already been stabbed into a bloody mess. When the sun rose and the three of them walked out of the plane, they were shocked to find that the man's corpse was mangled as if it had been gnawed by wild beasts. Julia immediately realized that there were even more terrifying things around them. Not daring to dwell on it, she took her children and continued on their way, unaware that 2 baby king crabs were slowly crawling out of the man's mouth. Under the scorching sun, Ben's body was on the verge of collapse. Ignoring his mother's attempts to stop him, he plunged headfirst into the filthy water and began gulping it down. Julia and Casey hurriedly pulled him out, warning that the water was full of bacteria and drinking it could easily make him sick. But unfortunately, it was already too late. Ben grew weaker and weaker and now had to rely on the 2 of them to help him walk. By the time they reached the clearing, he no longer even had the strength to stand. So Julia had no choice but to decide to rest there. She and Casey gathered plastic sheets from around them and quickly built a sunshade, then gave Ben an injection of antibiotics. The 3 of them soon fell into a deep sleep. But just after sunset, Julia was suddenly awakened by a strange noise. Puzzled, she stepped out of the sunshade and was confronted by a horrifying sight, instantly realizing what had been gnawing on the man's corpse. Julia was terrified out of her wits. She woke her children and they ran for their lives, but the creature was right behind them, relentlessly pursuing the 3 without giving them a moment to catch their breath. Fortunately, after crossing the hill, Julia spotted an overturned cargo ship where several workers were gathering supplies from the ground. They initially wanted to lend a hand, but something even farther away scared them out of their wits, and they dashed into a shipping container to hide, completely ignoring Julia's desperate pleas for help. The 3 of them had no choice but to climb onto the shipping container, and at that moment, the creature revealed its true form. It turned out to be a massive swarm of king crabs. Several king crabs scratched Julia's calf, while even more crawled through holes and into the container. Although the workers fought back desperately with their guns, there were simply too many king crabs, and they were quickly devoured completely. Julia and the other 2 narrowly escaped with their lives, but she fell into a coma from excessive blood loss. When Julia woke up again, she found herself all alone. Her heart immediately tightened with worry, and she climbed down from the container to look for her son and daughter. She suddenly noticed a shotgun next to a worker's corpse, so she picked it up just in case. Fortunately, Casey and Ben hadn't gone far. They were just nearby searching for supplies. Once the 3 of them were reunited, Julia tended to the wound on her calf. She poured gunpowder from a bullet onto it, then used a lighter to ignite it. Enduring the excruciating pain, she managed to stop the bleeding. After that, Julia raised her gun and walked into the container where the worker had died horribly, while Ben picked up the weapon and walkie-talkie from the ground and adjusted the frequency, successfully making contact with Nava. After learning that the 3 of them had been attacked the previous night, Nava said that she too had been attacked by king crabs. She explained that the crabs live in crevices on the ocean floor, which is why they weren't swept away by the sea. Since they ran out of food, they started coming out in groups to hunt. Then, Nava delivered even more frightening news. According to the latest information, the seawater is receding earlier than expected, which made Julia panic. And to make matters worse, in her rush to escape earlier, she accidentally lost the map, so now she has no idea which way to go. Upon hearing this, Nava immediately fired a flare into the sky. The 3 of them hurriedly followed the signal and finally spotted the submarine in the valley below. But between them and their goal lay a rock wall inhabited by a swarm of crabs. In order to seize this last chance at survival, the 3 had no choice but to carefully weave their way through the rocks. But just as they were about to make it out, a large amount of rubble suddenly fell from above. Without hesitation, Julia pushed her children out of harm's way, but ended up trapped in the rocks herself. Staring at the path now completely blocked, Julia was utterly devastated. She no longer thought about escaping her. Only hope was that her children would survive. Her mother's words pierced Casey's heart like a sharp knife, but they also helped her regain her composure. She realized this was not the time to hesitate, so she dragged Ben, who didn't want to leave, and escaped. She decided to find Nava first, and then come back together to save their mother. The siblings climbed out from the rocks and ran all the way to the submarine, only to find Nava covered in injuries and barely clinging to life. She knew she wouldn't survive, so she decided to leave the hope of living to the two of them. But Julia couldn't bear to abandon their mother either, so she told Ben to stay and take care of Nava while she ran back toward the rocks. At this moment, the king crab swarm was slowly closing in. Julia could only desperately hold them off with her shotgun, but as soon as she blasted one apart, another would immediately take its place. Even after she ran out of ammo, she still couldn't stop the advance of the crabs. Seeing the swarm about to reach her, Julia was completely hopeless. She curled up in a crevice, waiting for death to come. Suddenly, Casey's voice came from above, and she reached out her right hand, trying to save her mother. The desire to survive gave Julia a burst of incredible strength. She forced herself to climb up the rocks and gripped her daughter's hand tightly. The two of them managed to escape from the rock wall and, using every ounce of strength, dashed toward the submarine. Behind them was a massive swarm of king crabs, surging like a tidal wave. In the blink of an eye, they dragged away the already lifeless Nava, then swarmed like a tide beneath the submarine. Julia fired her gun while covering her children as they scrambled into the submarine, then quickly climbed in herself. But the three of them were still on edge, because there was simply too many king crabs and the submarine wouldn't be able to hold out for long. At that moment, Ben and Casey suddenly saw a towering wave surging toward them from the distance, blocking out the sky. The sheer spectacle of it left all three of them frozen in place. It was Julia who snapped out of it first, ordering her children to get back in their seats and fasten their seatbelts. The next moment, the seawater crashed down heavily on the submarine, and the three of them felt the world spinning, tossed uncontrollably from side to side. No one knew how much time had passed before everything finally calmed down. The submarine had miraculously survived the catastrophe, but when the three of them climbed out from above, the sight that greeted them plunged them into even deeper despair. They saw that the entire city was shattered and broken, with not a trace of life remaining. And this was only the beginning of extinction. The end